Thank you, Professor Stobdan. Thank you to the organizers of this conference, the Japan Foundation, and to IDSA. It's always a pleasure to come to IDSA. I have a deep personal attachment to this institution, and so I always welcome the opportunity to come here. This is also a subject, India-Japan security cooperation, that is dear to my heart. It's something I did a fellowship a couple of years ago that just focused on India-Japan security cooperation and offered me the opportunity to go to Japan and as well as, of course, India, and meet with security planners in both countries. And so a lot of what I'm going to say, while it reflects my own personal views, is informed by that. I think what I'll do is I'll touch upon a few different subjects very briefly. One is the drivers of security cooperation. The evolution of that security cooperation over the last 15 years, quickly, some of the possibilities going forward, and also some of the limitations to the security partnership. I will address some of this very superficially because I know the other speakers will go into some of those subjects in more detail. I think it's important to emphasize that the India-Japan security partnership has completely transformed over the last 15 years. We now have institutionalized consultations between the two governments at the highest levels. We have regular naval exercises, regular staff talks between the two armed services. We have the prospect, a very realistic prospect, of defense sales and co-production, something that was unthinkable a few years ago. For India, Japan is now an indispensable partner in India's transformation into a middle-income society and is vital to the preservation of a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. And for Japan, while the US alliance remains the bedrock of its external security engagements, India is now comparable only to a relationship that Japan has with Australia, which one Japanese official described to me as a sub-alliance. Briefly, what are some of the drivers of this relationship? Very candidly, I think there's a shared concern about Chinese assertiveness in the new century. This is the single biggest driver of that defense cooperation. We've seen, from Japan's point of view, a series of developments, starting in the early 1990s, in fact, with the extension by China of law on territorial sea and contiguous zone. But it really accelerated a little bit after 2005, where there was a controversy over Japanese textbooks in China, and really between the period between 2010 and 2013, where a number of developments caused a great deal of consternation in Japan. This including the ramming of a fishing vessel by a fishing vessel of a Chinese fishing vessel of a Japanese patrol vessel. The protests related to the renationalization of the Senkaku Islands by Japan, an increase in Chinese vessels in Japan's contiguous zone and territorial waters. In 2013, the direction of fire control radar by a Chinese frigate against a Japanese destroyer, and the extension of an air defense identification zone by China into the East China Sea, overlapping with Japan's air defense identification zone. This does seem to have been led in part from the top. Again, so one of the other speakers will address this a little bit more, but in 2014, Xi Jinping gave a speech at the Museum of the War of the Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression, and yes, there is, in fact, in Beijing, a Museum of the War of Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression, which was quite strident in its tone. And then in 2015, of course, we had the parade in Beijing to commemorate the end of World War II. Again, with a lot of anti-Japanese rhetoric. In India, of course, we've had similar concerns. I won't go into all the details, but we do have a continuing boundary dispute with China, which extends quite far, where the terms are constantly changing. China believes that there's a different length to the border, so it's very difficult to engage with them on this. And we've had a series of incidents, the Depsang incident in 2013, the Chumar incident in 2014, and most recently, of course, at Doklam in Bhutan, where we've seen in all three cases Chinese forces, military forces, trying to change the facts on the ground with India. The concerns for India are not limited to the bilateral dispute, but extend to other issues, including the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, on the one hand, and the Maritime Silk Road on the other hand, and the concerns about the prospect of dual-use facilities being developed across the Indian Ocean region. It also extends, of course, to differences in the trade and economic realm, in bilateral trade and economics, and of course in terms of global governance and differences, whereas a few years ago you did see a great deal of India-China coordination on matters of global governance, we're increasingly seeing divergences on a number of issues, not limited to the nuclear differences over India's entry to the nuclear suppliers group. As a result, how have Japan and India responded to this? I think what we have seen, particularly under Prime Minister Abe, in his 2 terms, starting in his first term in 2006-07 and then the current one, has really been a very radical transformation of Japan's security architecture. I mean, this is nothing, I think the number of small steps that if you add them up together are nothing short of a revolution. It's remarkable to think about this, but in 2006, Japan did not have a defense ministry. It did not have a defense minister. And one of the things that the Abe government did in 2006 was elevate what was the department to a full ministry, a boisho. In 2013, we had the national security strategy, which I think Ambassador Hiramatsu was involved in. The National Defense Program guidelines were extended. A National Security Secretariat was established. And this, of course, made streamlined decision-making in the national security structures in Japan. We saw new principles for the transfer of defense equipment in 2014. In 2015, quite significantly, we had the establishment of an Acquisitions, Technology and Logistics Agency, or ATLA, which actually helps defense industrial cooperation with other countries. And then, of course, we've had this issue of constitutional reinterpretation. This has been, at the same time, we've actually seen some changes to the self-defense forces, including the reorientation of the ground self-defense forces away from an armor-heavy, northern-focused force to a more smaller, southward, increasingly amphibious-oriented force, and we will see the development of a 3,000-strong amphibious brigade soon. In India, of course, is important as a part of this. India is important for preserving sea lines of communication. India has capabilities in maritime domain awareness that very few countries in the Indo-Pacific have, and so it remains important for Japan for that respect. Cooperation with India also enables the Japanese self-defense forces to participate in out-of-area operations and exercises, including the Malabar exercises. And of course, weight counts in the balance of power, and I think that is very keenly appreciated by Japanese security planners. Similarly, we've seen changes on the Indian side. We've seen a hardening of defenses on the border, whether it's the extension of roads, the activation of airfields, the climatization of a greater number of Indian forces, the transfer of Indian frontline fighter aircraft from the Western Theater to an Eastern Theater, and increased patrols by the Indian Navy across the Indian Ocean mission-based deployments. India has also extended, of course, its defense partnerships across the Indo-Pacific region, most notably with the United States, which extends to now equipment purchases, maritime dialogues, and increased information sharing. With Japan, of course, and the Malabar exercises, I think, are a key element of that. With Australia, after years of a slightly tepid relationship, and with several countries in Southeast Asia, most notably Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Myanmar. It's important when we look at the evolution of this, the bilateral India-Japan security partnership. I think it's useful to think of it in 3 phases. The first phase was from 2000 to 2006. It's important. I think we were coming off a very bad phase in India-Japan relations after the 1998 nuclear tests, Indian nuclear tests, which went over very badly in Japan naturally. And so I think the visit by Prime Minister Mori to India in 2000 could be seen as a turning point at the start of a normalized relationship. The 2 countries described their relationship at the time as a global partnership, and we already start to see the Coast Guards cooperating in anti-piracy and search and rescue exercises. In 2004, we had a meeting of the defense policy groups, and we also that same year, in December of 2014, had this ad hoc cooperation in relief efforts following the 2004 tsunami that also included the United States and Australia. The second phase of defense cooperation started in 2006 with the visit by then Defense Minister Pranab Mukherjee. And this included, amongst other things, the first iteration of the quadrilateral meeting in Manila and quadrilateral exercises, a joint declaration on security cooperation, a bilateral India-Japan naval exercise, the GIMEX, which was agreed to in 2009 but only took place in 2012, which also speaks to some of the challenges. In late 2013, then Defense Minister Onodera came to India, where he came with a proposal for India to purchase the US-2 aircraft. This is still, of course, pending and been discussion, but this happened in 2013. We had an increase in staff college exchanges and port calls, and then in 2010, the 2+2 dialogue between the foreign and defense ministries. However, in this period, some doubts persisted on both sides, in both India and in Japan. There were some concerns in the Indian government about multilateral exercises, particularly in the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. And both countries tried in their own ways to try and engage with China, which led to, at periods of time, pauses in advancing the bilateral relationship. The third phase started in September 2014, and the two countries now describe their relationship as a special strategic and global partnership. And this included the permanent inclusion of Japan into the Malabar exercises, a change in India's position on freedom of navigation and overflight, and particularly in the context of the South China Sea. Japan added 2 new defense attaches to its embassy here in India, making it only the 5th country that Japan had defense attaches from all 3 arms of its self-defense forces. We had, of course, the civil nuclear agreement, and 2 defense agreements that were signed in 2015, one related to transfer of defense equipment, one related to classified military information. And then, of course, we had the quadrilateral meeting earlier this year, just a little while ago. This gets me to what are some of the possibilities going forward. If this has been the evolution and these have been the raison d'etre of the relationship, how does the relationship go forward? It remains, despite all of these significant changes in Japan's defense and security architecture, I feel that official development assistance, ODA, remains the biggest weapon in Japan's arsenal. And if deployed correctly and strategically, it can have an outsized effect. And this is already happening in many ways. We heard some of this in the opening remarks. But particularly if in the certain parts of India, which would help give India, have a catalytic effect for India's own strategic outreach. This could have an effect both in India and in other countries, in third countries. Additionally, I think more can be done to improve military interoperability between the other arms, not the maritime self-defense force and the Indian Navy, but the other services, the ground and air forces. And particularly the marine, in terms of improving both countries' marine expeditionary capabilities, and in terms of air force cooperation. And here the United States could possibly play a role as a sort of midwife between the two countries, because it has much more experience in those domains. There are, I want to end by just highlighting some of the limitations as I see it to the partnership going forward. One, I would inject a note of caution when it comes to the prospect of military sales and defense co-production. While in many ways it seems a natural progression for the relationship, it has often been an irritant in both India and Japan's bilateral security relations with other countries. The Japan-Australia deal over the Soryo submarines is a case in point, but we've seen that in India also with other countries, including most recently the Rafale deal with France. So while I think it is a natural progression, I think we should proceed with caution and not let it become an irritant to the overall defense partnership. 2, I think we don't pay adequate attention to each other's secondary security concerns. For Japan, that is North Korea. We have seen a pretty significant shift in India's own position when it comes to the DPRK in the last 6 months or so. But that being said, I think there's a feeling in Japan that India does not pay adequate attention to the seriousness of the issue. Equally, I think in India there's a view that Japan does not pay sufficient attention and show concern about India's concerns about Pakistan. And so I think we do need to talk more frankly about each other's secondary security concerns. Finally, I think there are some structural constraints. In India's on the Indian side, there's still important resource constraints that will limit the partnership and what India can do. On the Japanese side, I think there's still attitudinal and political constraints. There still is a very strong streak of pacifism in Japanese public opinion, and this will always constrain in some ways how much Japan can play a major role as a security partner in the region. So I think we should be conscious of this going forward. On a final note, it occurred to me, I came back from Tokyo about 10 days ago, and on the flight back I saw this film that has just come out called Sekigahara. And for those of you who don't know, Sekigahara is a famous battle that took place in 1600, arguably the most defining battle in Japanese history, which led to the unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate. And what's interesting, the film explores the personalities involved. And the losing side, what ended up being the losing side, the Western Army, was led by a man of strong principles named Ishida Mitsunari. And he had, at the beginning of the war, he had actually a lot greater forces, but he also had a very loose alliance. And what ended up happening was people defected, people did not respect his authority, and so Tokugawa, despite having smaller numbers, was able to defeat him. And I think that there's some cautionary lessons that we can learn from that as we enter this new geopolitical landscape. So let me end on that note.